thank you so much, and thank you all for the time and the opportunity. This is great. My background is in regional integration, and particularly on North American integration, so I took the theme of this conference very seriously. What would be the next steps in the North American integration process? Oh, right. There we go. What would be the next steps in this process? So, I'm going to start out by making three utterly bizarre-sounding claims. The first claim is that more North American integration is likely, and likely in the near future. The second rather bizarre claim is that it's going to be robust, relatively speaking. In fact, it's likely to skip what would be typically understood as the next phase after the free trade agreement phase that it's in, which would be the customs union phase, and go straight into something more along the lines of a common market, or as the Lisbon Treaty, based on that definition, an internal market. We can talk about the distinction more if you'd like. The third utterly bizarre claim is that this integration is going to be driven in no small part by national security policy. So those are very strange claims. Claims that I would have found strange when I began my academic experience in graduate school, and I only came to this kicking and screaming over the course of many years, being barraged by a bunch of facts that in fact go along with this. So, first of all, in case the bizarreness of these claims isn't registering with you 100%, there are at least two fairly obvious reasons why these sorts of predictions might seem problematic, and they're staring at you right there on the screen. One of these two people, for better or for worse, is about to become the President of the United States. And neither of them like free trade, or so they've recently said. Hillary Clinton has come out stating that we need to revisit the NAFTA process, revisit free trade in general in North America and elsewhere. Donald Trump is, as far as I can tell, basically a neo-mercantilist. He's not in favor of all kinds of things that begin with the word international, including trade. He doesn't like NAFTA and a whole bunch of other things. And so one of these two people is going to be the executive of the United States, and I am still suggesting that in the near future we're going to see yet further integration. Obviously, I have to justify that. As if that wasn't bad enough, since NAFTA came into being back in '94, so 22 years ago, NAFTA itself was a sea change. It absolutely transformed the way states in North America relate to each other, the trade flows, and a whole bunch of things. But since NAFTA came into being, there has not been a tremendous amount of forward development beyond it. Piecemeal in certain respects, but in a sort of comprehensive policy way, not that much. This is given a sort of exclamation mark by a report that was done back in 2014 on the 20th anniversary of NAFTA by these three people. You might recognize one or more of them. The gentleman on the left, anyone recognize?
The gentleman?
Yeah, it's Sandro Petraeus, who, when he was at the CIA, got very interested in North American integration because he was interested in energy independence. After he had to leave the CIA, for reasons you may have heard about, he devoted a lot of his time to this issue. Bob Zellick, former U.S. Trade Representative and former head of the World Bank, and then the lady to his left is Shannon O'Neill, the authority on Latin America at the Council on Foreign Relations. They produced a report in 2014 and are obviously very proud of it, and they went on a bunch of talk shows. And basically what they said is, we need to do a little bit more. So not anything particularly ambitious in that report, all things considered. So in short, we're about to elect someone who doesn't like free trade, and free trade heretofore has not been particularly robust after NAFTA. So what am I talking about? Allow me to try to explain this. So my analysis is based on an understanding of the historical patterns that have played out and are likely to continue to play out in North America. Let me tell you a little bit about those patterns, and I can tell you a lot about them if you want to in more detail. Since the United States began efforts to establish free trade with Canada, liberalized trade used to be referred to as reciprocity agreements, eventually evolved into a larger notion of a free trade agreement. There have been 13 attempts between the US and Canada to do this. Started with the gentleman on the left, that's John Quincy Adams. And on the US-Mexico side, okay? Oh. Okay, sorry. On the US-Mexico side, there have been 7 attempts at establishing liberalized trade agreements. The 13th attempt between the US and Canada was the CUFTA agreement. I'll talk about that in a second, in '88. 1988, US-Mexico, obviously the last one was NAFTA, which included Canada. Okay, that's interesting. These countries have been trying to trade with each other for a long time. It happens again and again. That's great. The bulk of my research has been to show the following point, which I think is the most interesting point, which is that of those 13 attempts at liberalizing trade between the United States and Canada, 12 of them have been directly connected to national security motivations. In the US-Mexico case, all 7 attempts at liberalizing trade have been deeply connected, tightly connected to national security policies. What does that mean? I can give you a lot of detail on that if you'd like more detail, but let me give you a very sketch version at the moment. In North America, in the Western Hemisphere, the threat generation has taken various forms. A key pattern has been the involvement of outside powers into the Western Hemisphere, and for most of the history of these states, that's meant European powers. Britain, France, at one point Germany, and so forth, eventually the Russians, and that has produced certain reactions. Either these 3 states in dyadic form, so either the US and Canada or the US and Mexico typically, have responded to those outside incursions by either pairing up to combine resources in one way or another against that external threat to balance it in some fashion, or that external state was brought in by one of the 2 smaller states, either Mexico or Canada, as a way to balance against the United States. There is a tremendous amount of history on this, both for Canada initially, eventually got over this habit, but especially for Mexico up until the NAFTA agreement, to use European powers in particular to balance American power. How do trade agreements work into these patterns? They work in one of 2 ways. Either the trade agreement was used to bind these states that are pairing their efforts against the third-party state, and I can go into the nuances of that if you'd like. Essentially, that's trading to oppose a third-party state, or they're used to control, in some fashion, influence the state with whom they're trading. So the United States wants to control Canada from becoming more closely integrated with the UK. They want to control Mexico from becoming more closely involved with Germany or the UK or France. Trade agreements can be used to exert influence over those states who are conceived of as threats, just as they can be used as by states to enhance relations against a third-party threat. So, the point of the book I wrote is to show that these patterns were very much on display in the creation of the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement of 1988, which was then blended into, so to speak, the North American Free Trade Agreement of 1994. I would have never assumed this was the case. I went to this case study assuming I was going to find evidence to disprove this theory. And as I mentioned yesterday, what happened when I did that is I landed upon some evidence about something called the Arctic arms race, which I had never heard of, never knew was even plausible, had no idea why there would be an arms race in the Arctic, until I began to find more and more evidence that caused me to recognize that at a certain point in the Cold War, as mutually assured destruction began to break down, cruise missiles came online, and various other things happened, that people began to think again about winning the Cold War. And I'd never thought this way before, but it's so obvious. If you're going to attack the United States, probably the best way to do that from the Soviet Union is over the Arctic, and vice versa. And what I began to find in research and interviews and so much other data is that, in fact, that motivation was closely aligned to the decision to create the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. So that's the bulk of the book. The other part is to show what happened with NAFTA. NAFTA is an even more interesting case. After the end of the Cold War, Carlos Salinas, president of Mexico, is terrified of the United States. This is a long history of Mexico being very concerned about American foreign policy. The Cold War ends, the first thing the United States does is invade a Latin American country and topple its elected representative, quasi-elected, and giving reasons that would somewhat apply to Mexico, should the United States wish to turn its attention to Mexico in that regard. Carlos Salinas is not only on record in the 1,300-page book that he wrote, but he had explained this in an interview to me, and it's come out in various other fora, that he proceeded as follows. He went to the Germans, went to the Europeans in general, the Germans in particular, and said, I want to establish a trade agreement as a part of a process of balancing power, as we have many times in the past with the Europeans, against the Americans. And the Europeans said, we're not interested in doing that unless you're actually already integrating with the United States and Canada, and thus us pairing up with you will lock us into a much more dynamic, large-scale North American enterprise. Which is to say that Carlos Salinas decided to engage in a free trade agreement with the United States in order to get a free trade agreement with the Europeans in order to balance against the United States. Okay, so that's the background. In the 2 decades after NAFTA's enactment, these major security threats that had prompted efforts at integration in the past in the Western Hemisphere were tamped down temporarily. Russia, as we all know, in the immediate post-Soviet period was declining in a variety of ways. Chinese power was just really beginning to go and take off in the 90s and the first decade of the 2000s, and now here we are. Europe, meanwhile, of course, is no longer really significant in terms of incursions into the Western Hemisphere. It's eventually, hopefully, going to, I think, hopefully develop its common foreign security policy to the point that it's actually robust, but that's still going to be a ways away before that enters into American security calculus. As a result, what that means is that after NAFTA came into being, not a lot happened. There were some very consistent attempts by certain scholars to call for greater North American integration. I don't know if anyone recognizes the gentleman on the right, but he was the patron saint of North American integration up until he passed away almost 20 years to the day after NAFTA came into being back in 2014. That's Robert Pastor. And he was, to the degree you would ever know about him, if you were in the public, the guy who always debated Lou Dobbs on CNN. Lou Dobbs does not like the idea of North American integration. You can tell that from the facial expression. And Robert Pastor, bless his heart, would go on this show constantly and try to explain to Lou, no, this is going to work. And then he died. So he, out of the picture, and
no incrimination of
Lou Dobbs made it. Yeah. So, what that means is that we had 20 years where not much happened, even though certain people really wanted it to happen. Now, this takes us to the immediate present. That is dramatically changing. I'm sure all of you have heard in various ways about Russian activity in the Arctic, about incursions into sea and airspace around the Arctic and Nordic nations. The level of this is unprecedented. The only time it has ever gotten to the point that it's getting to now was back in the early 80s, which is what launched the last time the US and Canada really engaged in a major effort to establish a free trade / security uptick in their relationship. Got going particularly end of 2014, really into 2015, and now we're 2016, of Russian activity in the Arctic. Why? You may have heard, unfortunately, it's thawing. And as a result of that, new sea lanes are opening. That means also new airways are opening, strategic opportunities of a variety of natures, and there are huge resources at the bottom of that ocean. Almost mind-boggling amounts of resources. There's a race to control the Arctic. That activity is generating precisely the kinds of responses in Canada, and to a certain degree already in the United States, in terms of how do we deal with this that generated the integration process that culminated in NAFTA back in the 90s. Meanwhile, and I'll talk about that more obviously. Meanwhile, to the south, we have this thing in the United States, and you may or may not like it. It's called the Monroe Doctrine, and it's the cornerstone of American foreign policy, and it's not necessarily generous or any number of positive attributes about it, but it's real. And the simple fact is that the United States goes crazy when a major foreign power comes into the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine stated under James Monroe, actually crafted by John Quincy Adams, that if you're a foreign power, don't come into the Western Hemisphere. We then had, in 1903, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. What did that say? If there are states in the Western Hemisphere that look economically vulnerable, and therefore would provide an entree for a foreign, non-Western Hemisphere power to come in and start setting up a beachhead, we, the United States, are going to step in and take over that country to make sure that it does not become an entry point for a foreign power. Flash forward to the present day. If I were to try to unnerve the American Monroe Doctrine instinct, I would do exactly what China is doing right now. They have selected a couple of very interesting partners to make their major sources or targets of investment. The gentleman on the top right, on your top left there is, of course, Nicolas Maduro. He is the president of Venezuela. Venezuela, aside from obviously the Cubans, the standard bearer of resisting American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. The Chinese have gone out of their way to establish close relations with him. The country the Chinese have given the most foreign investment to overall, relative to that country's overall foreign direct investment, is Ecuador. That's Mr. Correa, head of state there in the top right. Ecuador is maybe the second most vigorous opponent of American policy in the Western Hemisphere. So in South America, China chose the two states that you would calculate to choose if you want to upset the American Monroe Doctrine way of life. But my favorite in all of this, if I can put it in these terms, is the bottom one. I don't know if anyone recognizes the guy on the left there.
It's all about from Cheech and Chong, is it?
That's the guy from Cheech and Chong. But you know, now that you say it, that is the head of state of Nicaragua. That's Daniel Ortega. Daniel Ortega, I'm sure we all know, was not the friend of the United States back in the 1980s. In fact, the United States tried to get him out of power and got in a lot of trouble trying to do it around Contra, all the rest of it. He is less anti-American, but that's a matter of degree. He's still not someone the United States feels comfortable with. The gentleman on his right, since you now know that's Nicaragua, does anyone have a sense of what that gentleman on the right might be about? No? That is, his name is Wang Jing, I'm gonna double check that. He is in charge of the Hong Kong Canal Company that is going to be building a canal, or so they say, through Nicaragua. He is a private citizen, quote unquote, and if you want me to talk more about why I just said quote unquote, you can ask me in the Q&A. I won't go into all the extremely interesting details on that now. But he has been assigned, he's been given the job of building a canal through Nicaragua, which is an alternative to the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal is the physical manifestation of the Monroe Doctrine. If you wanted to make the United States crazy, you would build an alternative canal. If you wanted to make them so crazy it was beyond crazy, you'd do it in Nicaragua. And that's what's happening. So what we see occurring right now is the Russians coming in from the north, the Chinese doing things in the south, precisely the sorts of behavior that has generated precisely those free trade initiatives in the past and general security initiatives. So what does this all mean? About 5 minutes. Okay. So the short version, which I can elaborate upon later, should you so choose, is what we should see happening is we should see the Americans and the Canadians beefing up their security relations, and you probably are all familiar with NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense. That should be increasing, and it is. That, in fact, is a list of things that have happened just in the last couple of years to dramatically escalate the NORAD relationship between the United States and Canada. NORAD basically allows for U.S. and Canadian military to function about as close as two militaries can function without being the same military. The details on that are quite interesting, should you wish to hear them. It is now becoming ever more so. If we were to continue moving in the trend we're at right now between the US and Canadians in terms of military integration, in 20 years, you'd have a single military. I mean, it's that robust and maybe less. So that makes sense, and what I would predict is that we're going to see more of that. We're going to continue to see more within NORAD integration. Now, the thing with Mexico is a little more complicated, because Mexican history has been a history of resisting the U.S. military up until very, very recently. Up until just a few years ago, it would have been unthinkable that Mexico would do anything with NORAD. The whole raison d'etre of the Mexican military is to stop American incursions, among other things. Because of the activity of the drug cartels, something unprecedented has occurred, which is that now Mexico and the United States are cooperating in a NORAD framework to begin coordinating military operations. This happened back in 2015, this Amalgam Eagle 15, which was a joint operation between the US and Mexico, and NORAD in Mexico, in fact, to respond to a war game, essentially exercise. Now, that is about the drug cartels, but if I were to draw upon what I've learned about the history of US policy in Latin America and how it would be thinking about the Chinese incursions, I would expect the Americans in the coming years to be building upon this starting point of working with the Mexicans to make sure that that's secure, but also then extending that into the CAFTA countries, the Central American countries, and so forth. So the basic prediction from the military front is ever more integration along the NAFTA or the NORAD lines between the US and Canada, and amplification from a very low starting point within NORAD of Mexico and the United States, and eventually the actual incorporation officially of Mexico into NORAD. And finally, how will that pair with economic integration? Why not a customs union? This is not my simple argument. I'm just building off of other scholars who have said that the customs union approach, which would be the next step in a free trade agreement, isn't really practical because the two small economies are so interwoven into the major economy that the political will you'd have to expend would be a lot, because it's another step in an integration process, but the payoff would not be much, because so much of what you get from a customs union you have de facto, because these other economies are so totally interwoven already into the US economy. Which then says, to my mind, that the next step to take is what I've labeled there in NAM, a North American market. And I'm thinking of a North American internal market. We can talk, as I said, about those distinctions if you want. I think I might be, at the moment, alone in calling for this, or suggesting this might happen, but I'm by no means alone historically in doing this. Not only did Robert Pastor recommend this, but former Mexican presidents have suggested this. There is a history here of people suggesting this is the case. What I'm offering is a different analysis of why now most people who study North American integration are interested in economic policy solely. They don't couple it with the security policy angle. And so unless you do that, the suggestion that now of all times, when we're about to have this election, these particular people getting elected, the idea that this is a good time to start economic integration, that's not going to resonate with a lot of people unless you couple it with the security angle. How and when? I expect that it will probably happen by the initiative of the US and the Canadians. That usually gets going before the US and the Mexicans in terms of talking about any kind of economic integration. Obviously, it will have to happen after the coming election. And on that note, I would simply say, in the 13 times that the US and the Canadians have tried to do further economic integration, and in the 7 between the US and Mexico, on multiple occasions it's happened when the public in one or two of the countries didn't want it overall. It's happened when the party in power had it in its party platform not to pursue free trade. And it happened when, in certain cases, the person who came into office as head of state ran on opposition to free trade. So, lest we all think this is absolutely impossible, that's that. And as a very final note, what are the implications of integrated North America? I truly do think that once a process, the next major step in North American integration gets underway, say a North American market creating process, that is going to show people that regional integration in a robust fashion is not simply a boutique enterprise undertaken by some European states, that it is happening in multiple regions, it's happening in a relatively thoroughgoing fashion. And once the general public recognizes that, I think that's a game changer, because what it's going to show is there's a global pattern, a multi-regional pattern, and what does that portend? What does that say about relations amongst other states if the most advanced economies and robust democracies on the planet, mostly speaking, are engaging in these processes? Does that suggest other regions will as well? And what happens between those regions eventually? And the little graph I have up there is just or the images are the pictorial representation of something that Andreas mentioned in his presentation, which was there was this poll taken about whether you consider yourself to be primarily a global citizen or a national citizen. And that's the outcome. The countries with the bigger pieces of the pie are the ones who are more likely to say the populace is, we're national citizens. And why I have that up there is that I think that this is not going to strike that, it's not going to be that huge of a change in the global population's thinking when they begin to see this is happening regionally, to start taking the next step of thinking, okay, maybe this is happening globally, and how do we start to think about it? For all the change it's going to represent, I don't think it's going to have to be something that people are going to have to be shock therapied into appreciating the basic logic of it.